Now, that is distinct from urban designers who have an interest in everything to do with cities. There's been a description of an urban designer as being a specialist generalist. So we have an interest in city structures, street patterns, blocks and lot patterns, public space quality, and share that interest with landscape architects, land and building use, ecology, and all of those things of buildings which architects are involved, are very, very interested in, that is central to your work. So there is certainly a difference in the scale and the range of interests, but urban designers don't often get to design buildings. They design frameworks, guidelines, and processes to achieve buildings and spaces. Now, I'm going to offer 9 thoughts on urban design. And the first is that urban designers focus on the public realm and the public interest. And I'd like to quote, I've recently bought a book, Conversations with Frank Gehry, published 2009, and he wrote, "Now what happens now is that buildings are built haphazardly, 1 or 2 at a time, and there's no real sense of community. They're just economic engines that somebody puts together, usually not with architects who think about things other than doing what the client needs." Now, that's Frank Gehry, 2009, America. Perhaps it may not apply here. And he continues, "You get a client, and the client may be one person or a group of people. The client needs a building, and you design, produce, and deliver it. You try to be within their budget, serve their purpose, and solve their problem. There is a responsibility beyond that to the community, both the community close in and the community at large. And this is something on which architects are idealistic." Now that's reasonable, and it's probably a fairly common view with architects here as well as in the States. But it's telling that Gehry describes responsibilities to the client first, and then after that to the community. Because in urban design, it's the other way around. The responsibility is to the community first, the public interest first, and after that comes the building. I was going to paraphrase JFK again, but Alistair's already said that. Ask not what your city can do for you, but what you can do for your city. Now that sort of sums it up. Now, for an urban designer, if that means that the scope of possible private development is compromised only for good and justifiable urban design reasons, then that is what may have to happen unless by design a mutually acceptable solution can be found. Now, as an architect, as I say, I spend some of my time doing design review. I don't buy the argument that there is only one way to design a building, because I know you guys are all too good. You know you can design things in many different ways, and you can design for anything. It's like engineers who say, you know, that the structure has to be like this. Well, you know, we don't necessarily accept that either. So I know that architects will be able to find a solution to make the building work in its urban context, and often it is the client that is laying down the law that the building shall be like so. So that the challenge is through design negotiation to be reasonable, but to achieve good results. So while architects often design both buildings and the spaces around them, they usually focus on the buildings, and I suspect that's what most of you usually do. That is buildings before space. Urban designers also consider space and buildings, but emphasise space before buildings. So that leads on to the second thought. Urban designers aim to create positive open space. Now here we have Jane Jacobs writing in 1961. Now in case some of you, I think you should probably see it from here, but think of a city and what comes to mind? It's streets. If the city's streets look interesting, the city looks interesting. If they look dull, the city looks dull. Now that's 50 years ago. But Jacobs' observation still rings true. Now, she challenged the then orthodox approach to the design of cities, that is modernism, that buildings would be pavilions and flowing green open space, you know, towers in the park. And she made a case for spatial definition and social life on the streets. Now that idea was being explored by others. Christopher Alexander called it positive open space. So we're talking about positive space versus leftover space, and not buildings as objects. Now we can look at, the first thing I should observe is there's also sometimes a charge that urban designers are inconsistent. Now I find it really interesting that Alistair and I didn't talk about our presentations, yet we've both used the same examples of iconic open spaces, Piazza San Marco in Siena, Piazza del Campo in Siena and St. Mark's in Venice. we can compare some New Zealand examples with some spaces like these that have been around for some time and are a recognised standard. So we see with the European examples and some of the New Zealand examples, space that is consciously shaped and defined. Dimensions are important. Sometimes smaller is better. Nothing looks worse and is more deadening than a vast but not used and therefore barren public open space in the city. Now, spatial definition isn't simply enclosure, it's about dramatic manipulation of space. It can be openness and enclosure, a connection between spaces. A space which is poorly connected will inevitably fail. Now, Auckland is struggling. Now, I share Alistair's concerns about that. I was involved in that, and one of the things I looked at was all the schemes that had been done for Aotea Square over the years. And in all of them, including a project I worked on finishing about 2.5 years ago, there is definition at the southern end of the square. And everybody that's ever looked at Aotea Square said, put a building at the south end of the square, put an edge that people can sit against, provide shelter, spatial definition. I don't think that's happening, which is unfortunate. Cathedral Square in Christchurch is perhaps overly large, it's problematic. Wellington is about right, Civic Square, you can see it, the rather smaller space in there, it's intimate, perhaps it's not as well connected as it might be. There will be occasions when a building should be a freestanding pavilion and has to be a pavilion, but even then its role in relating to the spaces around it is critical. So we need to think about the alignments of building frontages, setbacks, and particularly the edges of the building and that phrase, active edges. Now, I can't do better than Jan Gell's summation of active edges, of types of active edges. This he did, these are edges from Adelaide, and he used them in a document he did for Wellington. Now, the point I should make is this is about town and city centres, not residential areas or the suburbs, should we have those things at all, but this is right in the centre of the city. Because other types of edges are important in other places. Now, what we see, this categorisation from attractive up the top left, we see lots of glass, we see publicly relevant activity at ground level, places that buildings that people can go into. We see relatively narrow frontages, so there are frequent entries into the building, frequent entries along the street edge, what we might call a fine grain. Lots of interest, visual interest. And there's also activity looking over the street at upper level, windows looking out over the street. Now, in these sorts of situations, urban designers would want to see a great environment for pedestrians that's interest and safety, spill light from shop fronts, and also comfort. But if we look at what Jan Gell is proposing, if we move down, attractive, pleasant, the frontages are getting wider, somewhere in between, starting to lose shelter, and that's looking a bit mediocre. Dull, there are windows, sure, but there's no interaction between the inside of the building and the outside, and no entrances. And then E, unattractive, lots of glass, but it's blocked off, and no entrances whatsoever. And then Jan Gell talks about the worst situation. It's mean, in fact it's miserable, in fact it's not acceptable. And interestingly enough, these sorts of edges often happen around major public buildings, big developments which have all sorts of servicing requirements, and there's always a pressure to sort of put that stuff somewhere, and that's where we often see this sort of edge. Now, there are different types of positive open space, and I'd like to refer to the Highline Park, which is a new linear park in Lower Manhattan. It opened only about 8 weeks ago, thereabouts. And it's not conventionally defined. It's an old railway line, in the elevated railway line. In the slide to the left, you can see the bridge going across the street. You can see a stair up to the park, and there's a fence on the top right of that, which is the boundary, and behind that there are the construction sheds. This is about half completed. They've made about 900 metres of this, and it goes for 10 New York City blocks, more or less.